Hey everybody, Jeff Straw here at Pyramind with another episode of Producing Out Loud. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to have, I'm super excited. It's my phrase du jour, I think, but I'm always super excited around here. Today I've got Thavius Beck with us, joining us remote. Thavius.
Hello, what's up everybody?
Hello to the kind people of the internet. And my good friend Moldover.
Greetings, internet.
Today we're here to talk about hardware and controllers, and specifically, what do you really need a piece of hardware for your workflow, and how does that impact your workflow? And I think the two gentlemen we've put together to have this chat today have very, different approaches and different angles on this topic, which is why I figured it would be cool to get you guys here together. And really have had a pretty long-standing history with tactile controllers in the music space. So again, thanks for your time, Thavius. I know you're a busy guy. You're heading off to Europe here shortly, and thanks for coming in again. Always good to see you. So without further ado, let's kick things off. I think it's always good to look. When we're looking at something like controllers, things have clearly evolved. That's not news to anyone that things have really kind of progressed in the last few years. But Thavius, why don't we start with you and just give us a quick sense of your, one of your first main controllers or pieces of hardware that you were using in your studio to produce, and where's it come from, or where's it gone to today?
Well, I think probably a good place to start is just to kind of acknowledge that when I first started out producing, I wasn't using any software, just because most of the software that was available was either just really immature for what I wanted to do, or I was just so used to the hardware stuff that I had and didn't have a strong enough computer to do all the things that were in my head. So once I finally got my hands on Ableton Live, that was the first piece of software that I really started trying to perform with and produce with a bit more, a bit more intentionally, I guess. The main thing I wanted was something that kind of mirrored the hardware that I've been using before that. So one piece of hardware that I used a lot was a keyboard sequencer workstation called the Roland W30. And with that, you could sequence, you had some synth sounds that were pretty rudimentary, but you could also sample. And it was a 61 key keyboard. So being able to have that sort of feel where I could lay out different samples across different keyboard zones and then be able to play multiple samples, all at the same time, that's something that was really important to me, But then shortly after getting into Ableton and starting to work with some of these other hardware companies that were making controllers, the grid-based, the button-based controllers became like a really big thing. You had the APC-40, and then shortly after that, you had the Launchpad. And to me, that was awesome because it was a great way to really play with Ableton Live in a way that just made more sense, that kind of mirrored the interface a bit more. And for me, that was kind of the beginning of really diving deep into, quote unquote controllerism, So it's interesting to see now because now you have so many different types of controllers that combine keys and pads and knobs and faders. And you can pretty much get any combination of that you want from 10, 15, 20 different pieces of MIDI controller, where before that was kind of a new thing, So I think the main thing that I'm seeing now in terms of the evolution is just that there's a lot more options that let people interact with the software in different ways, where you don't need 4 or 5 different controllers. One just has knobs and one just has faders. You can kind of get those combinations all in one thing,
Sure.
But for me, initially, it was just being able to play buttons and not just have to, use my mouse and my computer keyboard and to really feel like I'm interacting with the software and actually playing the music, and not just programming it. So
and that seems like mostly from the live perspective, but also in the studio for you.
Oh yeah,
like
definitely,
right?
Definitely. I mean, there's just a certain, and again, speaking personally, and I'm sure a lot of people share the same sentiment, but if you're used to playing some sort of instrument, even if it's just playing a drum machine, there's still some sort of human element to that. And to be able to touch and sort of incorporate your own rhythm based on how you play that piece of gear, that hardware, I think it's important. So, when you're performing, it's great because people can see that you're actually doing something and not just staring at Facebook, right? But if you're at home, to be able to really kind of get into the groove and get that sort of human feel and movement and translate that into the music, I think is really important as well. So yeah, it's important in the studio and on stage, I think.
Yeah, there's a feel groove element that you will absolutely never get with a mouse and clicking in, right? Unless you're copying someone's groove. But if it's coming from you, you need that tactile sense. So
definitely.
My friend.
Yeah, were
Moldover.
you left off on that with the, I guess what I call traditional musical interfaces. That's always been really important for me because before, my first recording device was a tape machine, followed shortly thereafter by computers. But I came up playing guitars and singing and learning drum kit and all that kind of stuff and just multi-tracking myself. So it always started with this extremely visceral, physical way to express myself musically. And the recording devices were sort of ancillary to that. And so that's always kind of like, that's kind of a built-in preference that I have. If I had drum machines and synths when I was like 8 years old, like it's so easy to have now, it'd be a different situation. But no, I love that stuff. So that's why it's always been so important to me to have controllers. And then I think that's why I got into like hacking and eventually making controllers, is because I wanted, the things that I mix with and the things that I trigger samples with. As I got deeper into electronic music, I wanted those electronic instruments to have the same kind of expressiveness and intuitiveness that things like keyboards and guitars have. So yeah, it's always important for me. And even in the studio where it's, isolated and whatever, and nobody's watching, like if I'm not banging on something as part of the process, or like, singing or vocalizing or something, it's just not it doesn't feel quite like making music, I guess.
Yeah. A little too sterile.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've sort of shied away from the traditional kind of grid-based controllers that we were just talking about, obviously with some of the stuff that you've created, and I'm sure before you were getting into creating your own, just experimenting with stuff that was out there. Talk a little bit about...
Yeah. Well, I guess, I was making controllers for Ableton before there was anything like an APC that existed. So, there was always that session view on Ableton, which is prime for representation as a grid. But for me, like, my grid was tremendous, like I had this massive bank of sounds and samples, and like I needed to access all that stuff. So I just had a different process in my head, and I wanted something in my hands that kind of like looked and felt like some cross between like a gaming controller and like an MPC and a DJ mixer. It was just like something that didn't exist, but I felt like should exist to control Ableton. And the grid controllers are awesome. I think it's so amazing that like a totally unique musical interface just like showed up like 10 years ago and has become so mainstream. That's something that I just like was praying for before it happened, and now that it's here, it feels like it's like a vindication and sort of it's been the biggest thing for me, that I look around at the musical landscape and see like, yeah, controllerism is here because so many people play controllers like that, and that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, they become de facto, right? When you go to see a live set, somebody's got something that's controlling Ableton for the most part in a live set electronically, right? Now, Thavius, when you came and did your event here with Keith McMillen, you had a slew of hardware with you. And I mean, we can kind of cut to some of that footage. I know you had the Electron and you had quite a few other things that were actually generating sound. So moving away from simply the controller side, I know that you've, currently are using a whole gaggle, for lack of a better word,
a gang of black boxes,
of MIDI locked synths. Talk a little bit about that live setup for you currently, and has that already evolved? That was, I guess, about a year ago that you were here. And why all the hardware instead of just controllers? Like, what is it about those boxes that you love so much that you're willing to lug it all with you?
Well, it's well, before I get into that, I'll just sort of kind of clarify what the current hardware setup is that I'm using.
Yeah.
So for years I performed mainly
you mean
using
a gaggle
Ableton Live.
of boxes isn't what you call it?
The gaggle and Googleplex. It actually, that's the name of the tour.
Yeah,
actually.
okay, cool.
Gaggle of boxes.
We're co-branding that. Thank you very much. You heard it here first. Okay, go ahead.
We're getting stickers made right now. But I played with Ableton Live and either a Launchpad or the Q Neo from Keith McMillen, and that was like my main sort of gig rig, And what was really cool about it is that not only could I control stuff in Ableton Live, but I could send light feedback back to the controller to do like, little light tricks and spell stuff out, or it just made it a much more interactive kind of thing. But one part of me felt like, using Ableton in that way, I don't want to say it limited me, because Ableton's kind of like this limitless sandbox really, but my approach to it became too familiar. I'll put it to you that way, and it started being a little bit less exciting for me just because it was so predictable what I was doing, and I wasn't really sure like what direction I wanted to go in, But really, most importantly, the main reason why I'm focusing more on hardware is because I had some crashes with Ableton Live during a few live sets that were just like heartbreaking, honestly, and one of them happened when I did a Boiler Room set. And if anyone goes on the Boiler Room and they see my Boiler Room set, there's like a 5-minute pause in between where Live had crashed and I had to restart it. And thankfully it happened like at like 15 minutes in. So people just thought it was like an intermission, and then I came back to do part 2,
Nice.
But so I can play it off. But, at that point it made me realize like I would much rather just have dedicated boxes that just do this one thing. And if that means that I have to use 2 or 3 different pieces, then that's totally fine, and I'm still using, Ableton and Bitwig to do multi-tracking and producing for some aspects, but I started off with hardware. So kind of like coming full circle back to that, ultimately the whole reason for having these MIDI controllers is to give you that tactile interaction with the program so you feel like you're using hardware, and having hardware that gives me some of the options that I have with the software that I've got made it a lot easier to make that transition, So my current hardware setup, again, I'm leaving for Athens tomorrow. I'm doing a gig with Saul Williams, and then I'm doing like a 7 or 8 solo show stint out there.
Nice.
So for my solo thing, it's the Octatrack by Electron. That's like the main brains of the setup. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a sampler sequencer. There's 8 audio tracks. There's 8 MIDI tracks, and it has built-in time stretching. And you can stream audio from the compact flash card. So the samples can be up to 2 gigabytes in size. And there's a built-in crossfader. So oftentimes when I'm playing a show set, it's kind of like a live DJ set with all original stuff. It's just all beats that I made, and I'm using a bunch of different effects and, crossfading and whatever. So that ended up being the perfect sort of solution for it, But there's only so many effects on the Octatrack, and, I like to be able to have access to more effects freely, So the way the Octatrack's set up, you have 2 sets of outputs and 2 sets of inputs. So I have the SP404. It's another little sampler. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with it. If not, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Boss, Roland, and any sort of hip hop producers that are into, Dilla and Madlib and stuff like that, I'm sure are like very familiar with it. It's become a mainstay in all the beat scene kind of shows that you see. But I'm primarily just using that for outboard effects. Okay. So I can run the outputs, the Q out of my Octatrack into the SP404, trigger different effects on the fly like reverb and delay, slicers, stuff like that. And then the output of all that is running through my analog heat, which is another piece of gear by Electron. And I just use that to basically kind of fatten up the signal from the Octatrack, do basic EQing. It's a completely analog signal path, so it just sounds really nice and warm. Mm-hmm. There's a setting on there called Clean Boost that can really fatten everything up. And I feel really good about it. And it's nice too, because instead of just having the one controller, I've got 3 different distinct pieces of hardware. And if anyone happens to go on their fritz or whatever, I've got something else I can immediately jump on and start playing around with. So that little bit of extra confidence of just like not worrying about something crashing or freezing just frees me up a lot to just have more fun and play around, So, but again, before I do that, I'm doing a gig with Saul Williams, and for his show, we're using Ableton Live and Push. Because with his set, I'm basically playing stems from his album and running certain things through different effects, but it's a much more simple kind of setup, versus what I'm doing live. Mm-hmm. So I still go back and forth.
Nice. So I'm curious, with your original stuff, how much of the production is done on the Electron and on those machines that you're taking on the road with you, or is it stuff that you created completely differently and you're resampling in order to play live? Like, are you stemming stuff out and making loops from other gear, or are you using that same stuff in the studio and then it's all sort of native?
It's kind of all over the place. A good example is this. So a lot of times, I'd say a lot of the stuff that I made maybe between 5 and maybe 2 years ago was stuff that I was either doing on Ableton or Bitwig. So all stuff that's, in the box basically. And then I'm either exporting, the entire stereo file, or I'm exporting the drums separately from the melodic parts. There's vocal samples, I might export those separately. And then I bring them all into Octatrack, and then I can, loop them and play around with different arrangements as I see fit, But more recently, I've been doing a lot more stuff just with the hardware, So with the Octatrack, if I'm doing stuff on there, I'm basically just recording it in stereo into my DAW. If I need to separate it, I might record maybe 2 or 3 passes, but I'm not like separating every single thing, So I'm generally working with larger groups of sounds as opposed to individual stems.
So you're kind of committing to the mix stuff, and committing to to that structure, and then putting that to tape, or putting, to tape, quote unquote, right?
Right. To our 1 and 0 tape.
Right.
But
no, that's cool.
For me, it's nice because I don't really, there's a certain thing. I was talking to Alessandro Cortini, who's part of 9 Inch Nails and does his own thing. Really, really cool cat. I've known him for years. And we met up at some festival, and we just had a really good talk. But one of the main things that I took away from it was he was saying that he's just kind of jamming with his hardware and just recording what comes out. And what it is what it is, but he's capturing that live vibe as opposed to it being this very sort of like surgical process of, the endless sort of minutia of mixing and carving things out. And there's nothing to discredit that. Like, things that are really well mixed and well like recorded sound great, but sometimes it can sound a little bit sterile, So if you can capture that live feeling and that live vibe, I think the trade-off, if it's not too big of a trade-off, can actually really benefit you, because people really get a sense of they can sort of feel the energy in the room at that moment, you know? So after we had that talk, I kind of been going more in that direction where like, I don't have a problem recording stuff just from the hardware, whether it's stereo or, you know, maybe a few different buses from different gear, and just going with that live sort of feel. Plus, it minimizes the amount of individual files I have to deal with when I want to replay this stuff from the Octatrack. So, you know, there's a few different reasons for it, but that's been the approach lately.
So the live set is almost influencing the production set in order to make the live set easier, like this like cyclical thing in a way, in order to capture that element of the live element that you get in the studio. That makes a lot of sense, man. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, it helps to have an idea of how you want to present the stuff as you're producing.
Right.
You know, you may not have an exact idea what the live show is, but if you're sort of in the ballpark, it can influence your decisions and just make the whole thing a lot more cohesive.
I'm sure you would agree with that. Right?
Yeah.
Producing for the stage in a certain way.
Yeah, I usually point to the influence, like for my last record, of my friend Edison, who just plays a monome and like triggers everything live, and like his records are literally that. So like there is no difference between his live show and the records he was making a few years ago. But that inspired the process for my current album, which is it was all about trying to bring the production and the performance aesthetics like closer together. And that's I started working with like fewer stems and trying to minimize the instrumentation and write stuff. Like a lot of what I do is like live guitar solos, and all the vocals happen live. So a lot of it was forcing myself to like perform the stuff when it was still in like a incubative kind of early stage, and write parts that were easy enough to play and sing that like I could totally do them live without it being an obstacle course of crazy fancy stuff like some of my previous music was. So like keeping it simple, I guess, was the aesthetic. That
make an obstacle course for yourself. Yeah. That's a takeaway right there. Right. No, and I think that's important, because a lot of stuff that you can pull off that one lick in the studio that one time, that's all great. But if you've got to do that night after night and it's barely beyond what you can pull off, then that's a stretch, especially when you're also trying to sing, right? When you're talking about a live instrument. Yeah,
well, being like a one-person band is it's a big challenge, and I mean, the more you try to do live, like the more challenging it gets, and the bar in general like is pretty low. But I think most people that really love music and have some kind of background as an instrumentalist are always going to be doing something, real time, and risks are involved, and computers crash, and
I was just going to ask, do you have any good computer crash stories?
I don't. Like, actually, like, it's my setup's really reliable, and it's usually not a crash. Like, when something goes wrong, it'll be like, I'm playing in the middle of the desert and the laptop's in the sun and it's overheating because direct sunlight on your laptop, no ventilation, that's a problem. So it's CPU starts over you're cranking that. So no, it's more like slow decay, and then, oh crap, put something over the laptop, get fans on that, start talking on the mic in the mixer for like 4 minutes to let it cool down.
Again, with the fanning.
Yeah.
Right, we need girls and fans.
Yeah. Fans.
It's all full
comes
circle.
in handy, I'm telling you.
Yeah, so, yeah, but I mean, that's part of what I love, honestly. And when I go to see a performance and something goes wrong, seeing how that performer recovers from it is usually one of my favorite parts of the show. I mean, if it's done well. If it's just like they get on the mic and get pissed off and start cursing out their tech or something, it's like, I don't know about this person. But when it's done well and they use it as an opportunity to like, oh, somebody give me like an acoustic instrument, or like I will start beatboxing, or seeing those kind of rescues, I think is really inspiring sometimes.
Right on. I remember Radiohead's entire board died at Outside Lands. Anyways, somebody got fired over that. So,
that's usually how that works.
Usually how that works. That scale of a show, like,
yeah,
little coffee shop bars, not so much. So we talked a little bit about the live element, sort of informing, I guess, the production element. Any takeaways for kind of newer, younger producers that are looking at this like slew of stuff to buy? I think that anybody that's producing music, whether we've been doing it a long time or you're getting into it, it's like the overwhelming Sweetwater, Guitar Center, Agita, I want it all, I must have all the new shiny things. I always try to tell people to sort of curb that as much as you can, and just learn what you've got and learn it in and out. But any sort of suggestions for guys like just getting into this and hopping on board maybe with their first controller or towards their first live setup? Thoughts on that?
I usually tell people to do less talking to people and do more playing, like go to a store, like while they still exist, like brick and mortar stores where you can like pick this thing up and bang on it. Like I think that has so much more impact on like how I connect with an instrument, is how it actually feels, how it actually sounds in person. And I think that's where people discover like, well, why does this thing cost more than this one? Or like, do I really want this feature? This one has a longer list of features. You know, when you like pick the thing up, hold it, ideally talk to somebody there who like understands more about it, then I think you learn a lot more quickly, like if this instrument is for you. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I like that. What about you,
Definitely. I agree completely. You know, I think it's just really important to not be sold on, you know, a list of specs, and to really, you know, like Moldover is saying, to get your hands on it and get a feel for it and see if it actually makes sense for you. And, you know, even taking that a step further, I think it's really important for people to identify what they're trying to convey as an artist before you even start thinking about like, what tool am I going to use? You know, there's folks who will get Ableton or get a DAW and they're like, okay, I need this controller because I saw so-and-so using it and they did some really cool stuff. But what that person was doing might not have anything to do with your skill set or what you ultimately are trying to convey as an artist, you know? And another part of that too is just kind of being realistic about, all right, are you trying to approach this more as a musician? Are you approaching it more as a DJ? Are you basically just putting together loops and just need to launch clips? Are you actually planning on playing some stuff out? Are you planning on mixing stuff live? Do you need faders? Like, you know, just really thinking about what are the most important things for you to be able to control in a tactile sense, and kind of letting that shape your decision as well, you know? So it really just depends. I mean, a good example would be like a lot of the, there were some older Novation controllers that used to use Automap. I got one, what is it, the SL Mark II keyboard.
Remotes.
And it's a really like capable MIDI controller. It's really old at this point. But it's nice because you have faders, you have knobs, you have the keys, you have an LCD strip where you can, you know, configure and name all your different, you know, map parameters. But it can be difficult for someone who doesn't really understand how to set that stuff up to really use it in a powerful way. You know, same thing with the Keith McMillen stuff. I love their gear, but someone who's just getting into controllers and is not that tech savvy, I would never recommend Keith McMillen stuff to them as a first choice, because you're not really going to get as much out of it as you would as somebody who kind of understands how to manipulate it and sort of use it how they want, you know? So you just got to be realistic about what you're looking for and where you're at in terms of what you're actually ready to start using, you know?
You know, I should mention that both you guys are mentors, obviously, and me as well, very much not in this space of controllers, but how important was it for you when you guys first got started to have somebody maybe come by your studio and kind of help you figure some of this stuff out, or you go into their studio and really learn their setup? Were you guys lucky enough to have somebody like that early on?
I mean, to be honest, for me, like I was kind of the guy where people would bring the gear to the studio and leave it with me for a couple of days, and then I would figure out and show them how to use it. You know? Just because I'm just like I'm just kind of a tech obsessed geek like that, you know. And it's not like I'm so like, you know, sharp musically or whatever. It's just I just have a passion for figuring that kind of stuff out. So I ended up being that guy, and I met a lot of people when I was younger that I would want to kind of like have geek speak with, that were very protective of their techniques and their workflow. And I always felt really weird about that, because I'm like, you know, I grew up in Minneapolis where, you know, every kid that went to school was able to join the band class, was able to take home an instrument for the entire year. There was this very sort of nurturing kind of thing in terms of music. And when I came out to LA, there was nothing really like that, you know? So I felt there was this huge void in terms of just being able to share and educate younger people. And when I realized that there weren't a lot of like electronic producers really doing that either, it just made me more passionate to want to share that, you know? So I've been fortunate to be around a bunch of people that have gear, that like to share their gear, and maybe don't know it technically that well. So they would let me play around with stuff, and then we could just sort of learn together, you know?
I love that.
Yeah.
How about for you?
And
yeah, similarly, like I was usually the technical mentor in all things, because I would be the person who would like, yeah, I will read this manual because I really want to learn this piece of gear, or, you know, I'll sit and play with it enough to really figure it out. So yeah, I have plenty of mentors in other regards. But yeah, I've usually been on the other end of the technical one.
That's good to hear. That's why you guys are the ones chatting today.
And it's good. That was a thought I had actually when, and during the last question is that, you know, I said like, oh, don't just talk to people, go out and try the gear. But if you know somebody who is doing something close to what you want to do, you know, and you can you get mentorship from that person. That's super valuable too. Like the conversation you started as far as, you know, what do you want to do? What do you enjoy doing live? Is it a musician thing? Is it a DJ thing? You know, it's sort of like counseling almost. It's like going through this list of questions, which I do with a lot of people, you know, to help them figure out like, what is your musical voice and how are you going to achieve it in this, you know, technical medium?
Yeah, not getting kind of overwhelmed with the technical choices and being able to hopefully get to the creative fun part. But you do have to break through that barrier of learning with any new piece of gear. And I think controllers especially, because they're not making sound right out of the box, right? You really have to understand them enough to get them wired. And obviously things like the push make that a little bit easier because they're so tightly integrated with a particular piece of software. But there's really kind of no shortcut. And if you use a shortcut of having someone come over and set it all up for you, you're still not going to really understand what to do when things go wrong. So, yeah, it's been cool. In my tenure here, I guess I've been here about 2.5 years, to see the learning curve of students just walking in the door who, you know, some have been producing for years and some who have really never done much of anything. Those first few months that they're here, like just the light bulbs going off and the eyes opening to everything production related, but certainly as it relates to tactile things like controllers and keyboards and learning the ins and outs of you know, how to get in and talk to the software and make it do what you want to do. It's a rewarding experience. I know you've taught for years as well, Thavius, and it's just such a rewarding thing to see, like, producers kind of start to realize the stuff that's going on up here to make it be able to come out of the speakers. It's kind of like, that's like why we do what we do, right? So
I mean, to me, that's kind of one of the most gratifying aspects of teaching, you know, is to be able to see people so, like, I don't know, so amazed and so satisfied with the fact that, like, oh, this makes sense. It clicks. I can apply this to what I want to do, you know? And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is the idea of, like, you know, being able to talk to people, not so that you can sort of take their ideas, but just to be inspired by, like, certain concepts that you may not have been aware of, you know, basic stuff, just like, you know, subtractive EQing to remove certain frequencies so that you clear up the mix. That's something I didn't even know about, as I wasn't even aware of that for years. And I go back to a lot of my old mixes and I'm like, oh, that's why it sounds like crap, because everything's producing low frequencies and it shouldn't be, you know? So just when certain things make sense and you can apply that to what you want to do versus like trying to emulate what someone else is doing, that to me is the coolest thing. And I love helping people try to discover who they are as artists. And that kind of goes back to the whole idea of, like, you know, what are you looking for in a controller? Well, who are you and what are you trying to convey in person? And then that kind of dictates that decision, you know?
Love it.
Go education, stay in school.
Go Browns. Oh, okay.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I mean, I feel like we kind of tidied this up into a nice little deliverable package here in this half hour we spent together. Any kind of closing thoughts or ideas around this whole thing, or perhaps maybe where you see this going in the next few years in terms of controllers and hardware? A little speculative finish here. Put you guys on the spot. I know you weren't expecting that.
I like to plug the other controller that I think is kind of growing and gaining the same kind of significance as the button grid, which is all the multi-touch MPE is what my friend Roger Lynn likes to call them, the multi-touch polyphonic expressive controllers, basically like the Rolly Seaboard, Hacking Continuum, Roger Lynn's Linstrument. There's a growing number of them. There's more obscure ones too, but those are the big ones. And I think those are amazing because I think they're getting inexpensive enough, and there's enough different ones out there. There's the one that's kind of like a keyboard. There's the one that's kind of like a guitar. You know, they're going to penetrate mainstream if they haven't already. And that kind of excites me because they're just so expressive, you know, like I put my hands on a Continuum, I think like 15 years ago. That one's been around for a long time. It's one of the lesser known ones, but it's one that just like I played one, we were talking about Mickey Hart the last interview we did, and I convinced him to get one, you know, and we got one, and it's like in the studio, and it's like so much cooler than the one I played 15 years ago. And it's one of those few instruments that I just sit in front of, and I get the same excitement and like joy and wonder that I got when I was like 8 years old sitting in front of a piano. You know, it's got this amazing built-in sound engine. It feels like so magical. And the sound engine in it just like sounds amazing, like instantly. It just, you know, I don't know. It's just like a joy to play these things. And yeah, and they have the expressiveness that like I was craving for so long. Like when I landed in this space, you know, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever. And I was like, oh man, why is it just these cheap plastic, you know, keyboards and the $5,000 Continuum. Like, there's nothing for me, you know. Now there's all kinds of stuff in the middle in there, and I think it's going to inspire people to like just, you know, make this beautiful, organic, expressive music in with electronics, and I just think it's going to be awesome.
Nice, I like that. How about you, Thavius?
You know, it's interesting because for a while, one of the only things that I really, really wanted was just a wireless MIDI controller, you know. And I finally got my hands on the Q-Neo Rogue, and it was great, and it was awesome, but it didn't really catch on. Obviously, you know, the Q-Neo and Keith McMillen stuff was a bit more sort of niche anyway, but the whole idea of like that sort of being a thing didn't really catch on like I thought that it would, you know. And then, you know, the idea of the MPE stuff that Moldover's talking about, I think that's a really, really interesting direction for a lot of people that, you know, want more musicality and want more expressiveness in their controllers and from their DAWs. And I can see that sort of expanding in a way, but again, that's also sort of a bit more niche, probably a bit more open than say like the remote control stuff. And then also there was stuff like, what was it? Hot Hand USB. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It was like this ring that you wear on your finger, and like based on X, Y, and Z position, you could, you know, manipulate certain parameters. And that seemed really cool, and I had one of those to play around with, but there was no way to actually put it totally at rest. So even if your hand is sitting still, parameters are still jittering, you know. There was the Leap Motion, which was like sort of like Connect, and you could plug it into your computer and it could sort of read your fingers and hands within a certain three-dimensional box. And that seemed pretty cool, but again, it seems a bit too niche. So I think what's really interesting is that there's a lot of ideas that are kind of being thrown out there, and we have the capability to try to implement all this stuff, but it's really a matter of like what's practical and what makes sense, you know? So I'm still really curious about that. Like the main new sort of thing that I've seen that actually has some musicality to it that I think has legs are the MPE instruments that you're talking about. You know, the instrument, even with Bitwig, like the touch display on that, you know, you have something similar where you have, you know, you slide your fingers up and down to affect timbre, left and right to affect pitch. And then if you have the pen, you can push in to affect pressure. And that's really cool. And that's all contained within the program on the actual computer that you're using. And then you don't need a separate piece of hardware, you know? So that to me is really interesting. But again, you're seeing that with Bitwig, which has a smaller installed user base, on Microsoft computers, which aren't normally sought out for music production, at least not in the States that much, you know? So there's a lot of cool stuff that I'm seeing. I'm just really curious what's going to catch fire, like say the Launchpad did, you know? The Launchpad and Ableton were a perfect pairing because suddenly it's like, oh, this is a new way to sort of create music. And regardless of how much the idea was ripped off from the Monome, the point is that it made the whole grid-based interface this popular mainstream thing that everyone is sort of implementing now, you know? So I'm kind of curious to see what that thing is going to be. There's tons of really cool stuff that say like, you know, people like me, people like Moldover, some of the more like, you know, creative tech savvy professionals are going to be using. But in terms of like, what's the new mainstream kind of trend? I have no idea. Like, I'm really curious to see what that's going to be. One thing I will say though, that I've been really impressed with is, and one of the main reasons I like Electron gear so much is I really like the idea of being able to use a dedicated piece of hardware as a sound card as well, and be able to interface with your software seamlessly with the hardware. You know, for example, say like the Analog Rhythm is a drum machine that they make, and I have one of those. And just with a single USB cable, you're able to send 8 different streams of audio to your computer, record that stuff in real time, use the effects on the hardware as send effects if you want to, and to be able to have that kind of marriage between software and hardware, I think is really, really cool, because you're not necessarily depending on one or the other, but they both complement and kind of strengthen what the other can do, you know? So I would love to see more of that. It's kind of like with the MPC Live, you know, it's not just the MPC Touch where it's some hardware that needs a computer. You can use it standalone, but you can benefit from utilizing it with the computer as well, you know? So I would like to see that kind of more widely accepted by some of the hardware manufacturers and some of the people that are making MIDI controllers, you know, give them some standalone features where you don't necessarily need to be tethered to a computer all the time.
I'm really glad you said MPC, because if we went this whole episode and nobody brought up the MPC, I think we might get flaming hate on YouTube for talking about controllers and hardware without mentioning the MPC. So thank you for bringing that home.
I started with Akai gear, man. MPCs, S900, like, yeah, much love to Akai. I would love an MPC Live, but that's neither here nor there. So.
Plug, you heard it here. So yeah, like I said, both these guys are available as mentors. If you've got comments, questions for us, drop it in the comments. You can always hit us at producingoutloud@pyramind.com. Thanks again for being here. I think this whole thing is going, because no one asked me, but I'm going to say anyways, back to the theremin. I think we're all pointing to the theremin. Sci-fi noises.
OG
for
electronic
everyone,
music.
right?
Yeah.
And Angelo Moore, yes.
What was the rolling keyboard with the D-beam on it?
I had that.
the
I
V-Synth?
had the 808, the SP808. Their sampler had the D-beam.
They put the
As
D-beam
well.
on
They had a
everything
D-beam
for
on a
minute.
couple things. Yeah, no, it was great because you could trigger samples and have that be your filter. And yeah, that was a fun little box. Yes, yes. Let's all just make sci-fi noises on the closing credits. We don't have closing credits, but if we did, it would be
make some up?
Thavius making sci-fi noises with his mouth.
With my imaginary theremin.
Yes. What everyone needs in their studio. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for being here. Always good to see you. Fist bump to you, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, boom. Good stuff, man. All right, well, until next time, I'm Jeff Straw. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you around.
If you're a music producer, subscribe to our channel and stay up to date on the latest Pyramind tutorial videos, track breakdowns, elite sessions, and more. Visit us at pyramind.com.